Well, Johnny, thank you so much for hanging out with me today. It's been great to be able to catch up with you again. I'm so excited. Just for those who might not be familiar with Johnny, is Johnny and I are going to be chatting all today about what's happening over with Israel and Palestine and the Middle East. There's obviously a lot of conflict that's going on that started on October 7th with an unprovoked attack from Hamas into Israel, killing 1,400 people. But Johnny, I want to let you know a little bit about who Johnny is. Johnny is the president of the Congress of Christian Leaders. He's an expert, really, when it comes to the intersection of faith and foreign policy. He has met with heads of state all throughout the Arab world, advocating for peace, advocating for all of this that he's been working on. He's personally been meeting, as I've just mentioned, creating a way forward for peace to happen. He's received a Medal of Valor as well from the Simon Wiesenthal Center. So, Johnny, I'm just so glad we're able to converse and chat. I want to start off with on October 7th, there's an attack that happened from Hamas jumping over the Israeli border, killing 1,400. Not just killing 1,400 Israelis and others, but savagely, brutally. It was barbarism in terms of how they conducted. And that essentially has launched us two and a half weeks later to where we are now. Can you give us a little bit of a catch up, maybe over the last couple of weeks, of what has happened since October 7th?
Well, before I get to what's happened since October 7th, I think it's worth noting this was an incredibly sophisticated attack. I mean, simultaneously, the Hamas terrorists shot a barrage of thousands of rockets while there was probably some kind of cyber attack on the smart fence which separates the Gaza Strip from southern Israel. They used these in effect these paragliders to take up over the wall, and then they burst through it, and there was literally an army of ISIS like fighters that went village to village, and then they went home to home and committed the single most significant slaughter of the Jewish people since the Holocaust. Right. And what they did to those people is just for what everyone has heard or seen on social media. I can just tell you it's multiply that by 10. And that is the level of the atrocities that were committed by these terrorists against these Jewish children, women, elderly people, including Holocaust survivors, because they were Jewish. So that's what happened on October 7th. And I should say the level of sophistication of the attack makes it pretty clear that the Islamic Republic of Iran played a very, very significant role in planning and executing this operation. And then since then, a pretty stable, reasonably stable part of the world has totally been upended. We're as close to World War III as we have ever been. Perhaps Israel is fighting a war of self-defense to crush the Hamas terrorists, which the world supported for the first 3 or 4 days, and then all of a sudden, I happen to believe it's latent anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish hatred, but all over the world is starting to change their point of view. So we're talking right in the middle of a really perilous situation in the Middle East. While we're talking, there are 222 hostages held, women, children from 5 months old to 95 years old. It's a really, really bad, dangerous, volatile situation that demands the attention of the whole world.
The politicization that's happened when it comes to justifying what Israel's response is or should be, trying to create almost a moral equivalence of what happened on October 7th to a response that Israel, in essence, is forced to take. I want to mention, I often feel that part of this turning away from Israel, as you mentioned, is anti-Semitism in the last number of days that's happened. It's almost as if people are forgetting and just washing over what happened on October 7th. And we can't let that be essentially something that we forget about and we move on from. because that is something that we can never tolerate at any part of the world. Doesn't matter what's happening or which countries are involved. And the reason I want to touch on that, because I feel like that's an excuse that people are just moving past to now condemn Israel for what they're doing, saying the carpet bombings of Gaza, carpet bombings of what's happening in the Palestinian area, of victimizing the people of Palestine, which there are victims happening. There's civilians that's caught in war. Of course, that does happen, and that are innocent civilians. But I want to go back and focus on what happened on October 7th, because in my opinion, you can't let anything like that happen. And my response would be, if that happened to someone in my own backyard, what would our response be? If that happened in the United States backyard, what would our response be to that level? Because that seems to be forgotten about, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, that's what they want us to do. They want us to move on from it. And it's like after 9/11 happened in the United States, saying, oh, that was 2 weeks ago. But now it's, it's November, whatever.
Yeah.
And it is incomprehensible that the world is attempting to make excuses for Hamas.
Yeah.
Hamas terrorists. I mean, they cut off the fingers of elderly people. They burned children alive. They decapitated children. They recorded it, by the way, and live streamed it while they were doing it, because they wanted the world to see what they were doing. I mean, we are starting to get more and more evidence now. There's a letter, a handwritten instruction note that was recovered from the body of one of these terrorists. We have a phone call that was taken from a cell phone of one of the terrorists, where he's calling his parents in Gaza on WhatsApp, or calling his parents and telling them to look at WhatsApp, because he sent them pictures of the 10 Jews that he had killed. He had killed an entire family. So this is not a both sides situation. This is something very evil happened. It demands moral clarity. It demands the world respond to it. And unfortunately, what is happening is people are trying to conflate the Palestinians with the Hamas terrorist in Gaza. And they're saying this is about Israel and it's about the Palestinians, but it's not about the Israelis and the Palestinians. It's about what was the equivalent of 10 9/11s. It's more than that. It's like 40 to 50,000 Americans being killed in one city on one day, and another 20,000 being taken captive. I mean, that is the scale, except for the atrocities. It wasn't like Hamas dropped an atom bomb. They used ISIS-like tactics from house to house. I mean, Hamas is ISIS. Okay, that Hamas chose to use ISIS-like tactics. Hamas is ISIS. And so we can't, our moral conscience demands that we don't move on from this situation. And by the way, the key tactic of the Hamas terrorists and their allies in Tehran is they want to deceive the world in order to get the sympathy of the world. And so they are constantly lying about what's actually happening. And unfortunately, they've deceived some pretty powerful people. But if Israel stops,
they're playing the game of identity politics as well. They know how to play the game to get sympathizers around the world, around the West. That's what's been happening with this propaganda that you see on that is really trying to almost make people sympathize with what's happened. And that I appreciate you saying what you said, because we can't let this go, the brutality of what happened. You cannot forget this unprovoked. Even myself using the word unprovoked, there would be people that would have an issue with me using that, because they're going to try to conflate the attack of terrorism on innocents, essentially, and conflate that, as you said, to Israel, Palestine, and the history of borders and land. And that's obviously a long conflated history, but they're trying to meld the two into one, when for me, you have to keep them separate, because the barbarism, the brutality was beyond. But
and by the way, this is going to get worse, because the international community has organized itself around an anti-Semitic position, and it's causing real harm. I mean, I was in Switzerland a few days ago. We organized a protest to demand the international community do more in order to get the hostages free, including these children, for goodness sakes. And in order to even hold our protest in Geneva, Switzerland, in this one of the most secure and powerful places in the entire world, it took the Geneva police plus 30 private security guards plus diplomatic security and the Swiss special forces in order to protect us, so we could raise our voice on behalf of elderly people and children who are being held hostage. My Muslim neighbors here are wonderful people. I don't live in a neighborhood with extremists. Most Muslims around the world are not extremist. But what's happening now is a very, very small group of radical terrorists and their sympathizers are getting the megaphone from the leaders of our world as they paint this moral equivalency. And there is no moral equivalency here. And the civilians in Gaza who are dying in war is awful. Civilians die in war, but the vast majority of civilians that are dying in Gaza are civilians that Hamas keeps putting forward as human shields. When the Israelis were dropping pamphlets telling the Gazans where to go to be safe, and Hamas started sending text messages to Gazans telling them not to believe the pamphlets that the Israelis are trying to trick them. So the Hamas doesn't care about Palestinians. They're willing to hate Israel to every last Palestinian is gone.
I want to tackle maybe a couple of thoughts that people might be struggling with when they're hearing, depending who they're listening to, what news outlet they're listening to, where they're getting their facts or their opinions from. So Hamas became in power in, I believe it's 2000, voted in 2005, 2006 in Palestine. They've been the governing body ever since. But if you look actually at their mandates, if you look at what they're about, they are not really interested in governing and building a state in which civilians can thrive. Is that correct?
No, that's absolutely correct. And everything that they've done has indicated that. Like the Gaza Strip is 25 miles of Mediterranean coastline. Okay, Israel left the Gaza Strip entirely in 2005. Israel is not an occupying force of the Gaza Strip. They gave it away. And Hamas has turned it into an Islamic State.
Yes, exactly. And so with that, when people are saying the Palestinians, they conflate Palestinians and Hamas. Hamas is a group that is dedicated to the killing and the extermination of Israel, of Jewish people. That is what they want to do. In fact, whenever there's aid or money or opportunity sent to help Palestinian civilians, Hamas is using that to build their own weapons, their own rockets, using that bent on killing Israelis. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. So what Hamas wants is not a two-state solution.
Yes.
The Palestinian Authority say they want a two-state solution. That's not what Hamas says in Gaza. Hamas wants a final solution. It's in their charter. They believe that from the river to the sea, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, there will be no Jews. Okay, killing Jews is in their charter. The total elimination of the state of Israel is in their charter, and yet my country, principally through aid to the United Nations, your country that you're sitting in, the Europeans have given hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars to Hamas in Gaza since 2005, both in money and in aid, billions of dollars at this point. And what has Hamas done with that aid?
Yeah.
They didn't build buildings. They built 300 miles of tunnels underneath the Gaza Strip to build this mass terror network. And some of those tunnels, until the Israelis found them, went underneath the wall. I visited one not long ago. It goes underneath the wall and it pops up in the ground. The Israelis found it. They shut it down. I asked the security official who showed me the tunnel, why did they build the tunnel? And he said they built the tunnel because they want to sneak into Israel to kill people. And that's what we saw on October 7th. And it's my taxpayer money, your taxpayer money, European money being diverted. And right now, while we're talking, the big thing is Hamas is saying that a hospital is going to shut down because there's no fuel.
Yeah.
Well, aside from the fact that they senior Hamas leadership, including the leader in Gaza, is sheltering in a hospital at this very moment, which has a bunker underneath and leads to their set of tunnels, their torture rooms down there, all this horrible stuff. They say another, it's not this hospital, a different hospital is going to, they have no fuel, so the power is going to go out. And yet, Hamas has at least 500,000 liters of fuel. The Israelis haven't blown it up. It's sitting there. You can see it in the satellite imagery. But Hamas won't use the fuel for the Palestinians because the Palestinians are dispensable in their war against the state of Israel.
Yeah, and to add to this, and there's a point I want to make at the end of this, is that even with aid and finance that's been given to be able to help them build their own electricity grids, bringing water, they've used that money, which could have helped Palestinian people, for their own military advancement to kill Jews.
Yeah, so, and even worse, I mean, they took water pipes, dug them out of the ground, disassembled them, and turned them into rockets.
Yep. And the thing that's really important to remember here, because even if there are people who are stuck, I don't know, we don't want civilians to be killed. How does Israel respond? Well, first off, you don't want to, there's no moral person wants to respond the way that Hamas. You can't have an equivalent response, but you have to be able to cut the head off of terrorism. And this is important to distinguish that when you have Hamas running the Palestinian people, when you have Hamas in power, there is no way that Palestinian civilians can thrive and grow because Hamas is not interested. They're actually interested in using them as shields to further their own terror, to further their own ability to kill Jewish people, correct?
That's exactly right. And how does that help peace? It doesn't help.
You can't negotiate. You can't have a conversation. You can't come to terms, as you said, no two-state solution where you can coexist, where there's been many opportunities in the past where Israel has shown and come forward to actually extend an olive branch, so to speak. What have they had to return over the last 15, 16 years or 18 years is repeated attacks against Israel. So
in fact, Israel once offered to give away the Gaza Strip at East Jerusalem is the capital of a Palestinian state, and almost all of the West Bank, with the small exception of doing a land exchange, because some Jewish communities had grown up in a certain area, and so they would trade certain land here for certain land there. They literally and they would allow the Palestinians to be the custodians of the Holy Mosque. They literally gave them every single thing that they asked for. And what did Yasser Arafat do back then? He left the table. Okay, so when you hear all of this stuff about the state of Israel being an apartheid state and causing it's a bunch of nonsense. 20% of Israelis are Arabs. The vast majority of that 20% are Muslims. They have a much, much higher standard of living than those in the Palestinian areas. We are being sold disinformation every single day by Islamists, not everyday regular Muslims like many of us know, but these extremists are lying to us, and our elected officials who know better because they're fearful of the extremists are parroting their extremism, and it is absolutely inexcusable.
So you mentioned earlier as well, there's almost veiled anti-Semitism that seems to be coming up. Is that part of the reason why you think this narrative is being pushed? Why is this being sold as Israeli as an apartheid state, Israeli as a colonialistic power that's trying to dominate, right?
Yeah, it's all a bunch of lies. I mean, Israel's had a continuous Jewish presence there for 5,000 years. Even the term Palestine, was a term the Romans used after they kicked all of the Jews out of Jerusalem and the surrounding areas after the burning of the temple and everything else.
It's an insult to the Jews is Palestina, right?
It's unbelievable. They paint all of these lies. But here's what's so interesting. I mean, the European Parliament did there were different people making different statements, and so they came to a common policy. And in the common policy, it explicitly says that Israel must eliminate Hamas. Okay, eliminate Hamas. That is the official policy of the European Parliament. Yeah. That's the official policy of the U.S. Congress. I mean, it is to eliminate Hamas. But when it's all said and done, as Israel embarks on eliminating Hamas, you find all of these armchair experts talking about international law and all of these things. Israel is the most moral army in the world. Okay, they have rabbis whose job is to advise the commanders of the IDF on appropriate measures to take as a matter of morality to protect innocent life. And I do think it's anti-Semitism. I think it's low grade and sometimes higher anti-Semitism, where it's like you have to question everything Israel says, but you believe everything the Hamas terrorists. I mean, earlier today, in the day that we're speaking here, one of the most distinguished medical journals in the world. Okay, it's called The Lancet. It's based in the United Kingdom. They tried to do a joint statement on what's happening in the Middle East. 2,000 medical professionals signing their name to the statement, and they couldn't agree to call for the unconditional immediate release of the hostages held by Hamas. Okay, so these are people who have promised as medical professionals to protect human life, but they can't get themselves to say that the hostages should be unconditionally and immediately released. So this is how deep the rot has gone. Our most famous educational institutions in the United States have all had, in effect, institutional endorsed anti-Semitism, either by their complicity with student groups or their silence altogether. George Washington University, on the famous Gelman Library that was provided by a wonderfully generous Jewish family. Just the other night, projected on the side of the Gelman Library, some student activists put "Glory to our martyrs, from the river to the sea." These not just anti-Semitic statements, but literally calls for a second Holocaust. Okay, that's what that is, and putting it on the walls of a building paid for to educate people by members of the Jewish community. Anti-Semitism is real, and as Christians, we have a special responsibility to stand with the Jewish people, particularly our own Jewish neighbors, in a moment like this.
Yeah, I agree, Johnny. And just for people, you guys who are watching, is Johnny and I are doing two parts. So we're in part one right now, and just in a couple minutes, I want to wrap up. In our next part, I want to get to Saudi Arabia and the peace that was potentially going to happen between Israel and the accords that were going to be signed. I want to get to Iran a little bit and Hezbollah. But I want to end off this portion just because there was a personal testimony that I heard very recently about one of an Israeli grandmother's experience that happened on October 7th. And really quick, I'm going to recap a 15-20 minute testimony on what her experience was. But she was with her daughter and her son-in-law, and they had a newborn baby, 10 days old. And these homes in the south of Israel, they're built with bunkers to withstand rockets, so that when an alarm goes off, they go down into their bunker. And this alarm started going off, so they go into their bunker. Essentially, after some time, they thought they heard gunfire and gunshots, and they didn't know what was going on. So they were able to check the cameras, and they realized there are men that are trying to break into their home. The thing with the bunker is that the way the bunkers are built, they're built to withstand rockets, but they're not necessarily built to withstand an army trying to break in through a door. So you can imagine the next number of hours for them was absolute hell as these men were trying to break into the bunker in their home that they were at. And the son and the daughter, the whole time, were essentially trading on and off, trying to keep the door handle held up just to keep the door pinned, while the grandmother who's giving the testimony is trying to calm and keep the baby quiet so maybe they'll go away. After hours of using their weapons to shoot at the doors, using RPGs to break at this door, and because it's cement, it didn't give, is that they eventually lit fire to the home using tires, diesel fuel, and all that to try to smoke and get them out. And if you've ever lit fire to diesel fuel or tires, it is black, thick, tarry smoke. So smoke is coming through the door. And they're essentially thinking in this moment, why are we fighting anymore? Our death is absolutely imminent. It's either by smoke and fire, or we're going to go out and they're going to wait for us. They have a tiny little sliding window that they took turns getting breaths and getting their 10-day-old baby to get breaths. And they are also at the same time had no idea of what was actually happening to the full extent in Israel. So they're also thinking, why is our country leaving us here? Why is our country not protecting us? What is happening? Why is no one coming? Long story short, hours and hours and hours of this is that eventually there were people came in and the terrorists in that area were killed and they were brought to relative safety in a nearby place. But this is part of the sheer terrorism, and they miraculously survived where many others did not get the same fate that they did. The reason I want to touch on this story, and I'm not doing it justice in terms of how in depth this story goes, but it is important to understand and to see the type of evil and hatred that is in this world, especially when it comes against Hamas wanting to exterminate and to kill Jewish people, and that sentiment has not left. And Johnny, I'm sure you've heard lots of stories similar to that as people going through.
But here's what I told my Jewish friends in Europe a few days ago, where it's very hard to be Jewish right now. Yep. I said, there's 700 million evangelical Christians, and we know you're strong, and we know the state of Israel is strong, and it will win this battle. But here's what I'm telling you, as the Christian community, we're going to build a great wall of Christian Zionism against this anti-Semitism around our Jewish neighbors and around our Jewish community. So if they're coming for you, they have to get through us first. And one of the best ways we can do that is to tell the stories of the horror of October 7th again and again and again, because the world wants us to forget, but never again is now.
Yeah. Well said, Johnny. Hey, for you who are watching, stay tuned for part 2. Be watching for part 2. I'm going to wrap up right now, but thank you so much. We have Johnnie Moore as we're talking about what's happening with Israel, Palestine, and Hamas. This is important conversations to be a part of, and stay aware. We'll talk to you guys next time.